Chapter 9. Take Care of Trouble. Trouble? You name that bear Trouble? Disobeying one more order, Jonathan had slept on the living room couch while his father was gone, and he sat up now, bleary-eyed but nonetheless awake. Yes, his father replied. Do you have a better suggestion? Jonathan didn't even have to pause to consider. Killer, he said. You should call him Killer. That's what he is. His father sighed. He's a bear, Johnny. He did what bears do. It's what I've been trying to tell you. Jonathan shook his head, trying to clear away the image of Mama Goose, dead and limp, and so soft in his arms. He said, I thought bears kill to eat. He didn't want her for food. He barely stopped long enough to smell her, just knocked her dead and went on his way. Dad sighed again. Jonathan could tell he was growing exasperated. What do you want me to do? Capture him. Take him away. Take him so far away he can never come back again. Jonathan cried. He's dangerous. You can't let him stay here. His father looked surprised. He also looked enormously tired. Well, we're going to have to catch him first, before we can do anything. But zoos aren't in the business of transporting animals. Besides, but he didn't say any more. He's a murderer, Jonathan said. He's got to be taken away. His father shook his head. I think we're mighty lucky that Mama Goose was the only fatality last night. What were you thinking of anyway, luring a bear to our deck with food and then following him through the night? I stayed back, out of the way. Dad snorted, a tiny puff of exasperated breath. Do you have any idea how fast that brownie could run if he decided he didn't want you following him and came at you? 30 miles an hour, I guess. Jonathan had read it somewhere. Maybe more? Yes, his dad replied. And do you think you can run 30 miles an hour, maybe more? Jonathan shrugged. When his father drew his eyebrows together in irritation, he said, No, I don't suppose I can. Johnny, his dad came over and sat down on the couch beside him. How many times do I have to tell you? Bears are wild animals, even the ones in the zoo like Jake. He's been around humans since he was a baby, and do you know how far I'd trust him if I had to go into his cage when he was in there? Jonathan started to shrug again, to show that he didn't know, he didn't care, but then he stopped. There was no point in annoying his father further. Not very far, he said. You're darn right. No farther than I could throw the big brute if he came at me. Jonathan nodded. Anyway, he said, trying to sound reasonable so his father would listen, Mama Goose wasn't doing anything to him, just making a lot of noise, the way she always does. All he wanted was to shut her up. And he... Jonathan swung one hand as though it were a big paw and found that he could speak no further. His throat had closed. I know, son, I know. His dad put an arm around his shoulders. And I'm sorry it happened. I know you really liked that old goose. Really liked? That didn't begin to describe it. But all Jonathan said was, Rhonda loved her too. I told Rhonda all about her, and you know how she loves birds. She thought Mama Goose was even better than the seagulls we used to watch over Lake Superior. Yes, Dad agreed. I'm sure Rhonda loved her too. Just hearing about her from you. But there you are. She's gone now. Actually, I think your she may have been a he. Mama Goose? A boy? Jonathan almost laughed, but then he began to cry instead. Big racking sobs that seemed to rise from the soles of his feet. He didn't think he'd tell Rhonda that. Too confusing, but he didn't know what he'd say to her on the phone now. Mama Goose was mostly what they'd talk about since he'd gotten here. His father said nothing more. He just pulled Jonathan closer. I've got an idea, he said, stroking the hair back from Jonathan's face. I think this would be a good day for you to stay home from school. I'll bet even your mama would agree if she were here to see you now. Jonathan sniffed, wiped his nose on his pajama sleeve, and half laughed. Being a teacher, his mother found very few excuses good enough for staying home from school. Fever, vomiting, or something major broken. That was about it. Would she understand about Mama Goose? What'll I do all day? He asked, though already he knew one thing he wanted to do if he was left alone in the house. Oh, I don't know, his dad replied. Read, watch a bit of television, maybe write a letter to one of your friends. How does that sound? Okay, Jonathan said, and then in case he hadn't sounded enthusiastic enough, and his dad might change his mind, he sat up straight and said, Good. Dad stood and pulled Jonathan gently to his feet. Why don't you start with a shower, maybe followed by another nap? You must have missed a lot of sleep last night." Jonathan nodded and headed for the stairs. He'd start with a shower, no problem. But he wasn't the least bit interested in a nap. In fact, a plan was developing for when his dad left to go back to the zoo. He was going to call one of the local TV stations and tell them all about Trouble. If they reported that a wild bear had killed Mama Goose, someone would have to do something about him for sure. Jonathan stood in the shower a long time, letting the hot water slam into his face. He stayed so long, in fact, and dressed so slowly that Dad had already eaten his oatmeal and gone back to the zoo by the time he came downstairs. So he fixed himself some Cheerios, even put his muddy jacket and the pajamas he'd been wearing into the washing machine. Then he got the phone book out to look up the number. The ring at the other end seemed to buzz inside his head. He waited. "KTUU, Channel 2, said a woman's voice. Jonathan's mouth went suddenly dry. He'd never talked to anyone from a television station before. He said again. Why hadn't he figured out what he was going to say before he dialed? "KTUU, Channel 2, the woman said again, a little impatiently this time. And so he blurted out the thing they needed to know. "I've got some news for you. It's something you're going to want to do a story on. There's a killer on the loose in Anchorage." For a while, Trouble kept moving away from the zoo. The trees in the residential area of the city were heavy. Keeping hidden from the humans who were beginning to emerge was not difficult. And if there were other bears anywhere around to challenge him for the bits of food he occasionally found, he didn't encounter them. After a time, though, he turned and retraced his steps until he was back at the outer zoo fence again. He prowled along it for a short distance until he came to a dip in the ground beneath some fir trees. He curled up in the inviting gloom of the trees, tucking his aching muzzle beneath a paw, and waited. Just waited. When it grew dark, he would go in search of food again, and maybe at last he would find a way to reach the bear behind the fence. Chapter 10. Good. And not only did the wild bear named Trouble by one of the keepers break into the zoo, while he was inside he killed Mama Goose, a snow-white goose that was a favorite of visiting children. The newscaster reporting the story stood in front of Jake's enclosure, but Jake, appearing shunning publicity, was nowhere in sight. Jonathan sat on the couch next to his father watching the news program, but out of the corner of his eye he was really watching his father. Dad shook his head. "I sure would like to know who told them," he said. "When they showed up at the zoo, there wasn't much we could do but let them in. They already knew the whole story." Jonathan felt a flicker of guilt, but only a flicker. Some things just had to be told. His father should understand that. He'd had a hard time at first, convincing the man the receptionist had turned him over to, not the reporter giving the story now, but some kind of editor, that his story was real. Only when Jonathan had finally told him that his dad was one of the keepers at the zoo had the man started to listen. Now the camera was showing footprints in the layer of fresh snow along Jake's fence. There were bare footprints on both sides of the fence, but Jonathan was through listening. He'd gotten what he wanted. The world knew that a wild bear had broken into a zoo and killed Mama Goose, a favorite of visiting children. The phone rang. Dad got up wearily to answer it. Jonathan leaned back into the couch, paying no attention to the conversation. It wouldn't be Mom. She and Dad had talked a long time last night, so she probably wouldn't call tonight. What would he tell Rhonda when he talked to her next time? Some of the stories he told her about Mama Goose might have been a bit exaggerated, he admitted that. Like when he told her that Mama Goose came running to meet him every time he came to the zoo. But he told her true things, too, like about the way Mama Goose would honk back when you honked at her. Rhonda was really excited about meeting her very own goose. "Well, that's it," Dad said, hanging up the phone and returning to the couch. "What's it?" Jonathan asked. "That was Pat Rawlings, the curator. Somebody called him from Fish and Game." "Yeah?" Jonathan said, not particularly interested. The news program had moved on, but they were still talking about bears. This segment was about how important it was for homeowners not to attract bears by leaving garbage cans out or having bird feeders that could be reached. Or loaves of bread on their decks, Jonathan added mentally. The newscaster was saying that about 250 black bears lived in the Anchorage area and about 60 brown bears too. When they lose their fear of humans because they associate us with food, they can become extremely dangerous. One of the rangers heard the news report about Trouble, Dad said. Jonathan sat up straighter, turning his full attention to his father for the first time. "Next time that bear breaks into the zoo, they want to be informed." "Why?" Jonathan asked, although he knew, of course he knew. "When Trouble leaves the zoo, they're going to take care of him." "Take care of Trouble?" Jonathan repeated slowly. "What does that mean?" "They're going to put him down." his father said in a flat voice, not looking in Jonathan's direction. Put him down. For an instant, Jonathan felt as though he had been kicked in the gut. Put Trouble down. Off him. Kill him. So Trouble would end up as dead, as limp, as useless as Mama Goose. Why can't they just take him away someplace so far that he can never come back here? Because they have a firm policy, his father said. Once a bear loses his fear of people, he'll get into trouble wherever he goes. He's too dangerous to be allowed to live anywhere. Bears like that have to be destroyed. Jonathan's head spun. For a moment he thought he might be ill, but then he drew himself up and took a deep, wavering breath. Good, he said. He said as though he meant it to. After all, Trouble would only be getting what he deserved, wouldn't he? Trouble stood outside the fence to Jake's enclosure and moaned softly. The older bear, apparently having tired of the nightly encounters, didn't respond. He didn't even emerge from his den. Trouble would have dug under his fence too, but unlike the perimeter fences that were meant only to keep humans out, the fences enclosing the animals were set in concrete. Finally, the young bear sat, then after another long period of waiting, curled into a ball right there, tight against the fence that kept him separated from Jake. He was miserable. He wasn't finding enough food, and his stomach roared at him. His broken jaw had never quit pounding from the instant the moose had kicked him. But most fiercely of all, he still missed his mother. More than he wanted the pain to go away, and more than he wanted food to fill his empty belly. He was still a very young bear, and he wanted his mother. Chapter 11. Trouble for Trouble. Jonathan's house was so close to the zoo that he could see the parking lot and the entrance gate from the corner where he waited for the school bus. He watched both now. He had told his father that he needed another day away from school. He'd reminded him, after all, that he was still terribly upset about seeing Mama Goose murdered. His father had said, in that way he always did when he wasn't really listening. When he didn't think what Jonathan was saying was worth listening to, and then handed him his lunch bag. So now Jonathan was standing at the corner waiting for the bus. The hour was too early for the zoo to be open, but nonetheless, a truck pulled up to the gate. On the side was written, Alaska Department of Fish and Game. The man who emerged held a rifle in one hand. Jonathan couldn't tell whether it was a real gun or one that shot tranquilizer darts, but he supposed it didn't matter whether they shot Trouble outright or tranquilized him now, then killed him later. Either way, the dumb bear was going to be dead. Good and dead. But was dead ever good? Jonathan didn't know. To keep himself from asking more stupid questions, he turned his thoughts to Mama Goose again, limp and silent, a pile of white feathers. Certainly there was nothing good about her being dead. Jonathan walked a dozen steps away from the corner, then returned to his former spot, right where the bus always stopped. It was what Trouble deserved, wasn't it? For someone to kill him the way he had killed Rhonda's goose. Not an instant's thought, just bam, and the bear would be gone. After all, Trouble had no business killing Mama Goose just because she was making a little noise. Nothing made sense anymore. And now the whole world knew about Trouble's crimes, and justice would be served, exactly the way they always said in crime shows. Another vehicle pulled up in front of the zoo, a white van with KTUU written on the side. A man got out and stood talking to the Fish and Game guy. After a while, he went back to the van and returned carrying a TV camera. So, not only were they going to kill Trouble, they were going to film the event so everyone in town could watch it while they ate their supper tonight. Jonathan's stomach did a slow flip-flop. Would there be blood? Would there be lots of blood? It wouldn't matter if there was, would it? Seeing Trouble die on TV would be like watching a bad guy get blasted away in a crime show, nothing more. He's seen lots of blood on TV, lots of creatures and even people dying. But you always knew the blood you saw there, however red it might be, was really fake. The blood, the limp body, all of it was fake. Trouble's death would be different, though. It would be real, because Trouble was real. At least he would be for a little while longer. Would he still be real after the Fish and Game guy finished with him? Jonathan turned away from the men in the parking lot and looked down the road and said, still no sign of the school bus. Why had his father given that stupid bear a name? Everything would be easier if Trouble were still just the bear. There were lots of bears out there, lots and lots. But the moment you gave one a name, even a not very friendly name like Trouble, he became the only one. There was no other Trouble. So did that mean that what happened to Trouble mattered? Jonathan took a deep breath, and just as he let it out, he saw the top of a yellow bus rising out of a dip in the road. He tightened his hold on his lunch bag and hunched deeper into his jacket. The bus rumbled to a stop and the door shushed open. Jonathan stared at the open door and the metal steps climbing up into the bus. Then he stepped back. "Hi, Johnny," Dorothy, the driver, said. "Missed you yesterday. Were you sick?" He said. Yeah, kind of." But he didn't move from where he stood, his shoes rooted to the half-frozen ground. A mew gull flew over, making its familiar sound that seemed almost like crying. Dorothy said nothing more. She just waited, her round face smiling, her arms crossed, leaning on the steering wheel as though she had all the time in the world. Jonathan took another step back. "You know," he said, holding his free hand in front of his face as though to shield himself from the force of Dorothy's smile, "I guess I'd better go back home. I think I forgot something." He expected the bus driver to argue, to tell him, as his mother would have, to get on the bus and quit being silly. If she had done that, no doubt he would have obeyed. He was not accustomed to ignoring orders from adults. But her voice, warm with concern, Dorothy said only, "Then how will you get to school?" "My dad," he answered quickly. "My dad will take me." And to his enormous relief and instant despair, she nodded. "Okay," she said, "if you're sure." And she whooshed the door shut again. Jonathan stood perfectly still at the edge of the empty road as the bus rattled off, leaving him alone. His breath came in short gasps. He was skipping school. He'd never done anything like this in his life. He flapped a hand at the diesel exhaust that hung in the air and turned toward the two entrance. He needed to talk to his father. He had to make sure Dad knew that someone from Fish and Game was at the gate. And the TV reporter, too. A gun and a camera. Dad had to be told. He had wanted something done about Trouble, to have him go away and never come back, and now they were going to kill him. And show the killing in the middle of everyone's dinner tonight. That wasn't what he asked for, was it? The voices woke Trouble. They moved toward him, floating on the cool morning air. First, he looked toward the enclosure that held Jake, but the older bear was still nowhere in view. Then he rose on his hind legs, trying unsuccessfully to peer through the dense trees that grew on each side of the zoo path. He dropped to all fours again. Where should he go? He could smell as well as hear the humans, even if he couldn't see them. Although everything in this place was permeated with the smell of humans, he could make out distinctly the fresh scent of the ones moving towards him. The smell didn't put him on edge as much as it had just a few days earlier. He had grown almost accustomed to the way it clung to everything in this new territory, and accustomed to the manner in which the disturbing smell seemed to be connected with food. Soft food, easy to chew, to swallow. Still, he wasn't so accustomed that he was going to stay here and wait for the humans to arrive. He'd go back instead to the place where he had dug in. He was all the way inside the zoo this time, inside both fences, but he had left a tunnel behind. He could still slip out easily enough. And then, there they were. He could see them. 3 tall humans walking on their hind legs the way humans did. Coming towards him, Trouble lumbered off the path and into the woods.